Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. The Economist magazine recently dedicated an entire issue to the topic of wokeism, political correctness. Why? Well, because there are dozens of examples every day that just make you want to shake your head. The World War II famous kiss picture in Times Square, a soldier grabs a woman as they celebrate the peace. Greta Zimmer, a nurse, George Mendonça, a soldier, they became lifelong friends. But the forces of moral indignation and righteousness declared that this kiss was non-consensual. Then there's Google's AI. If you ask for historic pictures of the Pope, you'll get a woman of color. Or George Washington is always black. Joe Biden apologizes for calling an illegal immigrant, and Canada is funding something called gender transformative demining in war-torn Ukraine. The examples defy common sense, but Canada, it seems, is more woke resistant than other places. So now you're about to meet Eric Kaufmann. He's a Canadian academic from Vancouver originally. He's teaching politics in the UK. In January 24, he launched a course called Woke, The Origins, Dynamics, and Implications of an Elite Ideology at the University of Buckingham. But he's also a fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is why we've reached out to him today in Wigan, in northeast England. In northern England, I guess, is where you are.
Well, thanks, Pamela. Yeah, I'm actually in northwest England. It's sort of between,
northwest. Okay.
Yeah, near Liverpool. It's an area called Wigan. So I'm just up visiting with some family. There was a funeral.
Okay. And are you gonna start talking with that accent? Should we be prepared for that?
Well, yeah. So for example, saying over there is over the. So that gives you.
I don't know whether that's politically correct. Maybe you're offending somebody, because everybody is offended by something in some context or another, which is, I guess, what we're talking about. So your report that you released in February, The Politics of the Culture Wars in Contemporary Canada. What did you discover about what Canadians think about woke or about political correctness?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to just get a quick definition out there, because a lot of people struggle over this. But woke is simply the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. And out of that comes the belief that equal outcomes in terms of whether it be race gaps, gender gaps, etc., should be zero at least. And also you should have emotional harm protection. In other words, one of these groups cannot be offended. The most sensitive member imaginable of one of these groups cannot be offended by anything. So that is sort of the ideology. And what's interesting, I've done these surveys of nationally representative surveys in the US and Britain. And I used a lot of the same questions. Because I'm Canadian, I thought, well, Canada, the policies and the politics and the media is probably more woke than on average than what you'd see in Britain and the US. I'd be interested to see if that's because the public is more woke. And what I discovered was, surprisingly, the Canadian public is not actually any different than the American and British public on these questions. And we asked about 50 questions around the transgender issue, around critical race theory and history issues, and around cancel culture.
So what you're suggesting is kind of the media is leading the concern and the discussion and putting it in the window, and Canadians are going, yes, but that wasn't really a big concern for me.
Yeah, so the media does not reflect the views, for example, of a large majority of Canadians. I mean, if you take the trans issue as a sort of extreme example of that, by a margin of 4-1, if we take minors getting gender reassignment surgery, Canadians are opposed to that 4-1. You would never know that from the media, for example. And even if you take the recent Alberta, the Danielle Smith announcements around gender reassignment surgery and women or transgender women in women's sports, for example, the articles on that in the media would tend to be critical. The people they would interview would tend to be those who are upset by this decision. So you wouldn't tend to get a kind of average person on the street who would reflect mainstream public opinion being interviewed a lot in the media. Yeah. So yeah, there is a divergence between where the press is and where the public is on these issues.
On so many issues, but we'll just stick to the ones that you've studied here today. There were some basic kind of questions. More Canadians disapprove than approve of people displaying preferred pronouns. I mean, they're not really upset, but like, what are they saying to you?
Well, these are all questions that we devised. So we just put it to people. Do you approve or disapprove of these things? Now, gender reassignment surgery, it was 4-1 against. The pronouns question, people having pronouns in their email signatures and Facebook page. I didn't expect this to go against, but actually it went slightly against. It was close. It was a fine balance, but it was slightly against. And that's quite surprising because there is absolutely no way in any Canadian institution or media organization you could ever imagine that to be the case, right? And that's what's quite revealing. Whereas in the US and Britain, there is significant opposition in sections of the media. These stories come up in Britain, for example, in the Telegraph, and the Conservative Party has pushed. They've sort of gone to the opposition leader and said, okay, tell me what a woman is. Right, tried to put the Labour leader on the spot and make him say what a woman is, and that's the kind of thing that doesn't happen in Canada, for example, even though the public opinion is identical. So it's quite something.
Very interesting. But I mean, you see it in the States too. I mean, they put that to the last Supreme Court justice that was appointed. Can you define woman, right? So they are kind of pushing the limit. Are we just more polite about it? We just don't like it, but we're just not going to say too much.
Well, the thing about being nice and polite is it's always about being nice and polite to who. So if you think you're being nice to a biological male who identifies as a woman and wants to enter a women's changing room, the question then is, well, are you being nice to the women in the women's changing room? So it's a framing. The way it's framed is always like, no, we can be nice to the trans woman without being mean to anybody else. But actually, the reality is it's a clash of rights. And in a democracy, you have to decide that by majority vote or by something in the Constitution. So I think that's a misleading framing that's often used. But I think in Canada, I think the elite norms tend to be more progressive than the mass of the population, right? So I think and because there has historically been higher trust in media and institutions in Canada, and I picked that up in the survey. So even right-leaning Canadians are somewhat more trusting of the media than right-leaning Brits or Americans. And I think that gives a little more leeway for the elites and institutions to diverge from the public.
Well, I mean, here we're just witnessing this in the wake of the State of the Union. I mean, Joe Biden, when he went off the teleprompter, said illegal, used that word. He was describing somebody who has allegedly committed a murder. And then he spent the next 4 days apologizing for using the word illegal instead of undocumented. And I think, and you see it on the media, people going, yes, but what about the woman he supposedly killed? Could we not be concerned about that? Like, this is really kind of highlighting your point there. Who are we worried about offending?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's sort of an oppression hierarchy. It's a bit like the more oppression points you have, be they racial, sexual, etc., you're at the top of a hierarchy, and then at the bottom is, white straight men who have no points. It's a bit like, an ace versus a 2 in the card pack, right? So the whole kind of ethics here revolves around if you are higher or lower in this hierarchy of oppression. And so if you're higher in the hierarchy, then people need to be nice to you. And if you're lower in the hierarchy, then no one needs to be nice to you, and you don't really count in the calculus. Really, what we should be doing is treating everybody equally, have a colorblind approach, but instead it's a very color conscious kind of, what's your identity? Okay, then you get to be treated this way. Oh, you're that identity, you get to be treated that way.
That does take us back to the roots, and you will know this better than I, but I was reading through this issue, and
Right.
the term woke goes back to 1938, Black singer Hootie Ledbetter, who said on stage, "Stay woke, keep your eyes open." He was referring to Blacks having to negotiate their way and manage the streets in Scottsboro, Alabama. Um, and then it kind of came up to modern day, the 2014 killing of Michael Brown, the BLM movement, George Floyd, etc. Um, so it's kind of, but that's where it sort of started, and now it's spread across. Is that your sense as a historian academic?
Well, I mean, I think originally, you would say when Black Americans didn't have their civil rights, they were being treated unfairly, segregated. There was a good liberal reasons to have a campaign and to want people to be conscious of this injustice, and that was a good thing. And then at some point in the mid 1960s, you went from Martin Luther King saying people shouldn't be judged by the color of the skin, but the content of their character, to the Lyndon Johnson and others saying, well, actually, one, equality of result.
Yeah.
And we need goals and timetables. So we have to have affirmative action, which means you have to have a certain percentage of African American contractors, African American employed. Once you move to quotas and equal results, you then say, well, to get to the equal results, we have to discriminate against, it was white people. It might now be Asian. If we're thinking about Harvard's, it might be we have to discriminate against Asians to get to the number of, because what's never mentioned is the flip side of these policies, the flip side of being nice to African Americans by giving a fixed percentage to them in admittance to Harvard means that you have to be pretty mean to Asians by saying, well, their personality scores are lower, so we're going to have to discriminate against them. And it's always the people who are losing out, who are ignored, and no one actually talks about the fact that this is really a clash of rights. So yeah, it's been a kind of a mutation away from classical liberalism to what I would call cultural socialism, which is instead of every individual having the same amount of money and status, it's got to be every group having the same amount of money and status.
And rights. I mean, you really touched on something which I think is at the core of all of this, which is I don't know anybody that doesn't subscribe to the theory of equality of opportunity. But when it becomes equality of outcomes and that you have to contrive that, that's where people really start to resist.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I mean, it can be the case that equality of outcome is a signal that there isn't equality of opportunity. But once you've, if you have, for example, an SAT test, or you have a blind audition for an orchestra, you've dealt with that issue of inequality of opportunity. And at some point you have to say, well, there might be other reasons other than discrimination why you might have a disparity. And this whole idea that disparity equals discrimination is a mantra of this equity diversity philosophy, right? And that is what I would call cultural socialism. And imagine if we said anything less than perfect equality of income between any two individuals represents discrimination. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, people, they have different outlooks on life. And so with different groups, likewise, some groups are going to emphasize saving and book learning and others not. Some groups are older than others. Just the average age is different. That's all going to affect the disparities. And we have to actually be a lot more rational about that and even-handed. So I just think it's very tough in our society, at least in the elite progressive culture, to accept any disparity as being in some way natural and not the outcome of something nefarious.
And when we rule out merit as a reason for access or promotion or hiring, it really does skew the purpose of the exercise here. If you want the best person for the job, or if you want the smartest students in the room, then you kind of got to judge them on those grounds.
Absolutely. And the thing is, if your concern is group disparity, I mean, Coleman Hughes is a commentator in the US who has a new book out quite recently. And what his argument is, look, if you're concerned about a disparity in terms of people entering Harvard University, it's too late by the time you get to Harvard University. I mean, you've got to be focusing on age 0 to
Right.
10. And
Yeah.
so if people really cared, instead of trying to rig the game at age 18, they would be focusing on age 0 to 10. But they're not interested in 0 to 10. They're interested in what the elite culture is interested in, which is admittance to the top corporations, the top institutions. And so there's no focus on what actually might help solve the problem.
And keeping the donors happy too. Um,
Yeah.
I want to go through a couple of the other things that are, kind of uniquely Canadian on this, because this is something that, troubles me. Canadians oppose removing statues of Sir John A. Macdonald by a 2-to-1 ratio, because that does speak to the sense of the denial of history.
Yeah, I mean, this is remarkable that almost every John A. Macdonald statue has been either put away or covered up or removed in
Yeah.
Canada. And yet, by a 2-to-1 margin, people are saying they don't want these statues removed. And by, a much larger margin, I can't remember the exact number, but it was maybe something like 90 to 10.
Yeah.
They don't want vigilante removal of statues. They're
Yeah.
opposed to people removing. I mean, if you have a process and it's the government after a deliberation, that's one thing. But this idea of statue toppling is totally opposed by the overwhelming majority of Canadians, and yet it's been happening and with very little repercussions for the people who do it. And I think it also gets to a bigger question around history. And you can say, well, Canada didn't do things perfectly.
No
There were
kidding.
residential schools, but again, the
Right.
residential schools thing. There's a book called Grave Error now by
Yep.
Tom Flanagan and Champion, which sort of really goes through the evidence and says, if we want to sort of assess the record of the residential schools, we have to compare them to day schools on reserves and people who didn't go to school. And when you do that, actually, there were abuses at the residential schools.
Yeah.
Yes, there were problems, but this is nowhere near the kind of awful genocidal, murderous thing that is portrayed. Kids were not taken away to go there. They were sent there voluntarily. I mean, there's all this context around the residential schools just completely missed. And then you get something as crazy as this sort of mass graves, 215 body story that came out of Kamloops. And one thing that was interesting in the survey is by a 4-to-1 margin, Canadians believe that, even though there's no evidence. There really is no evidence that it happened. I mean, you'd have to say, as a sort of, if this were a crime scene or if you were a scientist, you'd say there's just no evidence that this
But
occurred.
it was simply on the news 24/7.
Yeah,
And
and
so people do
because
come to believe what they hear, whether it's that story or
Yeah.
is Joe Blow guilty of committing this murder? If he's put in the window every day, everybody concludes he's the bad guy.
Well, that's right. And when you don't have any pushback in the press, when the press is all on the same page and the politicians are all on the same page,
Right.
there's no opposition, then of course people are going to believe it because they're not going to be reading Terry Glavin in the National Post or the few voices that are pushing back on that. But it is remarkable that in a society that is supposedly reality based, something like this, which is kind of misinformation in a way, the fact those stories have not been retracted or corrected, is kind of a story of misinformation.
Canadians are much less likely, according to your results, to call their country racist, as are the Americans and Britons, but perhaps that's because we have different experiences.
Well, the first thing to note is, by 70 to 30, Canadians disagree with the statement that Canada is a racist country. So only 30% agree. And that number is over 50% in the United States, for example, and it's 40 in Britain. So again, the opposite of what you'd think from a country where critical race theory, which teaches that Canada is a racist country, where that is sort of running pretty wild in a lot of schools. Now, we haven't done the survey. My surveys in the US would suggest that 90% of American 18 to 20-year-old kids have heard at least one critical race theory term, like white privilege, white supremacy, for example, systemic racism, all of which are unscientific, by the way, from an adult at school. And I suspect in Canada that's increased a lot and is pretty high as well. But yeah, so this whole demonization of white Canadians is because they have the fewest oppression points. They're seen as the oppressor. This whole ideology really is about who's oppressor, who's oppressed, on the identity grounds, right? And so white male is the bottom of the heap. And of course, it's completely illiterate historically. I mean, if you were to look at the way Aboriginal groups conducted themselves, which is normal, not because they're any different than anybody else, but human history, especially as we get in from the hunter-gatherer stage into the agricultural stage, is a history of slavery and genocide and colonization. And that's what was happening in Canada between Native groups. Now, I'm happy to have a discussion if you want to talk about how the Iroquois and Hurons treated each other and the West Coast Salish slavery. We can talk about that. And then we can talk about, Europeans settling and colonizing, and we can have a rounded discussion. That's not the kind of discussion we're having. It's all a morality tale of white equals good, or white equals bad, and Indigenous or others equals good. And it's just such a sort of illiterate story. So I just think every country's got this in its history and its past. We're not having that rounded, contextualized discussion.
And we've seen it kind of spill over today, even into the discussion about what's going on in the Middle East, which is somehow the Jews who went through the Holocaust, who have experienced anti-Semitism in ways that are unimaginable. Somehow they have now become the oppressor, and the Palestinians have become the oppressed, when there's a lot of different moving parts in how the land was divided up. That wasn't a decision by the Jewish state.
Again, it's a very complex, multi-layered history without no angels in this story. But on the other hand, it's this imposition of a very sort of binary black and white morality tale. And it's all the same critical race lens. Once you put those pair of glasses on that say there's a racial oppressor, there's a racial oppressed, the oppressor does colonization, genocide, and settlement, and the oppressed is the Indigenous person of color, then once you've got those lenses on, it doesn't matter if you're looking at Canadian history or you're looking at Israel, it's the same conclusion, and it's the same very clear black and white story, and you just want to turn your brain off and shout at the bad guy. That's the level, I think, the intellectual level that we're talking about.
What troubles me about all of this and these extremes, as you say, is that Canada truly is a country that is the product of immigration. We have long bet our futures on pluralism, that everybody could come and contribute and succeed and help the next guy. But when you then impose policies on that make it difficult to see it. I mean, the Prime Minister declares that diversity is our strength, but then if you don't control immigration inflows, and people are straining the social services system, and they're straining the schools, and they're straining the housing market, and they're straining the hospitals, then diversity is not our strength. So all of those things have to be part of a package, not just one-off statements.
Yeah, I mean, but diversity is kind of a religion for Canadian elites. It's not looked at objectively, because really, in any society, you have an optimal level of diversity. It's not something that should just be maximized. In fact, if we look social scientifically, you might actually come to the opposite conclusion, which is that greater diversity is associated with reduced social trust. Robert Putnam's written about that. Less sense of belonging.
Alone.
And again, economic development is lower in ethnically diverse societies where politics runs on ethnic lines more. There are all kinds of reasons why you don't want to get too diverse. You have to have assimilation to reduce the diversity level to an optimal level. In Canada, even though it's had a certain amount of diversity, although that's much exaggerated if you go certainly before about 1970, you had a certain amount of diversity, but you always had assimilation, actually. And that's not talked about. Not just people speaking English, but actually intermarrying and changing identity in a deep way. And so if you actually accelerate immigration, then you're actually going to lead to this high diversity, what Putnam and a number of others would call this diversity solidarity trade-off: greater diversity, weaker solidarity, which breeds a whole bunch of issues, including polarization, but certainly weaker attachment to place and community, which has a whole, again, knock-on effects on economic development and a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, this is just not allowed. It seems to me that Canada's still got this race taboo around immigration. That used to be there in some European countries. The migrant crisis of 2015-16 kind of more or less killed it off in Germany and Sweden because the far right, populist right, who've just been rising and rising really since then, made the center right say, well, we've actually got to talk about numbers here in Sweden. We can't just say that that's a racist thing to do. We have to actually reduce numbers. Once the center started to move, that changed the whole terms of debate. And now they can have a sensible debate over how many they want to let in. Whereas my sense in Canada is even the Conservative Party is shy about talking about reducing numbers because they don't want to be accused of being racist. And that's just an example of how this culture war also infects public policy, right? Because if the definition of racism is stretched out to include not being able to pronounce someone's last name, wanting to reduce numbers, none of which is racist, but can be framed as racist, just shuts down debate and the tensions build up and you can't have optimal public policy. So yeah, I don't know how Canada gets out of this.
Yeah, we saw that in the pandemic. You can't stop flights from China. That is racist.
Right.
That kind of stuff, obviously in the US. I mean, it's interesting to watch what's going on in the US on the illegal immigration, the migrant, the newcomers. The words change every other day, but they've got 10 million people that they don't know who they are coming across their border. And now even the Democrats are starting to freak out a bit. I mean, you can say initially, oh yeah, it's great to have, more people in and they contribute to the society, et cetera, but it doesn't look like they're getting the cream of the crop here in terms of what's happening.
No, and I think in a way, Trump, I'm very critical of many of the things he says about, the election was stolen and whatever. But when he says you can't be a country that doesn't control its borders is not a country, that resonates with a lot of people. It makes a lot of sense. One of the definitions of a nation state is that you have a monopoly of force and you control borders. And so it's just astounding that that's where the Democrats are. If you go back in history to Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, I mean, they were very much into border control and deportation, and they had no problem with that. But what's happened is that the woke element has become more and more powerful, infiltrated the Democratic Party, and now sets the tone. And so if even if Biden were so minded to want to sort of deport more and to have a more aggressive policy of policing the border, I don't think he could do it because the power of the donors and the foundations and the woke activists is too great. And that's the danger. But of course, what that means is they're going to lose because of immigration is probably going to be the thing that costs them the election. And you get a wild card like Donald Trump coming in. And by the way, the Latino vote, these are people who are tending to live in areas closer to the U.S. border, Latinos have really shifted towards the Republicans since 2008, every election. This is one of their big issues is border security. And so it's just, but the Democrats can't escape the strictures of political correctness, and they can't have that debate.
But this is an issue, the whole notion of the borderless worlds, right? Which is you're seeing from a younger generation of political leaders. But there is also at the same time, we just watched Portugal. I mean, there's a pushback in terms of how the leadership of countries that are dealing with this issue are now reacting and saying, okay, hold on here. We've got to have some rules in place. This can't just be a free-for-all, which is you go anywhere you want and somebody else picks up the bill.
Yeah, I mean, the surge in sort of support for populist right parties begins around 2014 in Europe with increasing migration across the Mediterranean. That ultimately resulted in Brexit and record levels of support. Le Pen at 43%, Salvini and the brothers, and then Meloni, and now there is almost no country in Europe. Portugal used to be one of the exceptions. It's now, as you say, 18% was the Chega vote. Ireland is the next domino to fall, I believe. Actually, you've had mass protests against migrations. Ireland was always held up as one of these great exceptions. We can do migration and we're not going to be like all these other European countries. Well, it's changing there too. And I think the June European elections, we're going to see the highest ever vote share for the populist right across Europe, to the point where that could tip the balance of power within the European Union. So we're now seeing really historic things happening in European politics. And by the way, Britain, people might say, oh, Britain's an exception. They're going to vote in a Labour government. And that's true in a way. But on the other hand, actually, if you look at the issue of immigration, that's the top concern for conservative voters. And the Reform Party, which is the third party, populist party, has been now polling around 14%. And if they get a charismatic leader, they might even displace the Tories in the vote in terms of vote share. So, I mean, I think, there is this real pushback against institutions, which I think have been paralyzed by woke as an ideology, that you just cannot have the label racist attached to you. Anything you say has to be squeaky clean. I think that mentality has meant that it's just impossible to discuss something like immigration without being attacked. And so people want to sort of hide. And the result is the pressure just builds up.
So is your sense from, the big picture shifts there that you're suggesting are in play, how does that play out then down on the street? Does that mean that people are going to go to their school boards and say, I don't want my Black child in a class for Black children only. We don't want that kind of reverse of the situation, or the gender issue, or are we starting to see a reaction to woke on the streets? You get a certain amount of it on American television. You see the parents who are resisting things, but is it any broader than that? What's your sense?
That's interesting. Yeah, in Canada, you've seen some school board level activity. You're now seeing a few premiers, started with Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick, and now Saskatchewan and Alberta. And so it's the beginnings, the green shoots of a pushback as these premiers realize they've got, in most cases, over 2-to-1 of the public, over 2/3 of the public are on their side. It's really an open goal. They've been too scared to go at it. They're tiptoeing around it on the gender issue. The big question, well, a number of questions. One is, will they go after this issue of this sort of demonization of Canadian history and this whole question of mass graves and and statues and Sir John A. and all of that demonization of Canadian history? I think that's where I would say the Conservatives at the provincial level or federally need to start to move into that territory, the way they've started to move into the gender territory. Because again, as you can see with that 2-to-1 view on McDonald or Canada as a racist country question, people are behind. They want to see some sort of rectification of this trashing of Canadian history and the Canadian past. And yeah, that is going to, I predict this is going to, play a bigger role in elections, this battle over the speech boundaries, over the boundaries of history, what's taught in schools. Now, in terms of mobilization, part of this depends on how well mobilized parents are. Right. In the U.S., there are organizations, Mums for Liberty, there are church groups. It's more networked and organized. It's less organized in Canada. Britain is also not particularly well organized either. I think in the places that don't have the sort of grassroots organization, you're going to probably have to rely on capturing a political party from the grassroots, and like the Conservatives, and trying to get them to focus on these cultural issues. So, for example, in Ontario, the voters are very much wanting this. The Ontario Conservative Party is just a liberal conservative fiscal party that is hiding from this issue. What you would ordinarily expect is either a third party challenge on the populist side or a faction within the Ontario Conservative Party, the grassroots, having a revolt and saying, we want to deselect these MPs. We want MPs who will reflect our views. I don't know how that happens in Canada.
Yeah. I think it was George Orwell that said, those who control the past control the future. And it brings us back to that question of, it's too late by the time you get to Harvard to rectify the situation. We need to be dealing with what kids are learning and what kids are being taught at a much earlier age. I mean, I had young nieces going to school who were required to write essays about basically how horrible white people had been to Indigenous people. Instead of turning that into a positive,
Yeah.
experience and saying, let's learn a little bit about our history and things that we did that were bad and things that we did. It's presumed that everything is bad. And then you get that resistance from a young person who goes, but I'm not bad.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's interesting that they'll never be taught about indigenous, never be taught that the Comanche almost wiped out the Apaches in a genocide, or
Yeah,
about slavery on the West Coast. So you have this totally romanticized, airbrushed view of the indigenous kind of noble savage. And I had a question on the survey. Do you agree with the statement? Native peoples lived in peace and harmony until the European settlers arrived in Canada.
right.
And you had slightly more agreeing with that than disagreeing, but it kind of shows you how that heavily romanticized, curated version of indigenous versus this heavily sort of the opposite for whites. They're just bloodthirsty settlers. The reality is things were pretty tough and harsh and pretty awful in many ways. So there's a lot of good that was brought in with the settlers as well as a lot of bad. That would be sort of the way to teach it objectively. But yeah, I think the schools, that has to be a top priority for right of center political parties going forward. We've seen it in the US with critical race theory in schools in Virginia with Youngkin, and Florida with DeSantis. But those sorts of campaigns where you were really going in and saying, no, this is the curriculum. You're not to teach these concepts that are unscientific and they're essentially biased concepts, right? But I think that needs to become much more of a serious thing, because a study we did in the US showed that the students who were taught large numbers of these concepts actually were much more likely to believe in affirmative action, reparations, white guilt, all of these things. So the teaching really has an impact on those
Yeah.
young kids.
Well, and if you're telling kids that math is racist,
right,
then you're also instilling in kids that there's not much sense learning those things if it's bad. And that's what troubles me, the associated concept when we make those declarations.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially, I think, hard when you deal with subjects like the humanities and English literature,
Yeah.
where there's been the whole, certainly at university level, it's all this sort of feminist, anti-racist approach. And so a lot of people are just tuning out, and sort of applications to the humanities have been plummeting, because who wants to study something that's seen as toxic and the worst
Yeah.
thing in the world? You're not going to want to study Shakespeare if the only thing you learn about him is he's a sexist or a racist or something.
So in your own experience, you've had this as well. And I'm not sure, but you left a university that you were at because you felt that your ideas, I'll let you have a swig. Well, I know I'm making you talk a lot.
No, that's okay.
But I think you've had your own experience with this in terms of feeling in the academic, and God knows you would not be alone if that was the case, that your views were too conservative and therefore you were not part of the mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, it was always never a problem with my department colleagues, for example. But once you get a few toxic individuals who are fired up social justice activists, they can make your life quite difficult. They can sort of get people to launch internal complaints. They can try and get you investigated. So it was a number of these radicals within the university. Now, the top management layer was fine. They just wanted these things to go away. And they were, I don't have a criticism of them, but it's once you get down into the layers of activists, they can sort of make your life difficult. Now, of course, the other problem is, in Britain and North America, it's about 10-1 left to right in the social sciences amongst academics. When you have a situation where it's 10-1, first of all, if everybody discriminates equally, it does. If you're the 1 and they're the 10, the number of people discriminating in your favor is only 1, and against you it's 10. So you're going to have to self-censor your views a lot more, right? The second thing is, when you get that monoculture, it emboldens extremists who exemplify this. And so I sort of said, well, I've done this for 25 years. I've been in the regular system. And I thought, University of Buckingham is a university that at least has a history that would mean it's going to be more pro-free speech. Now, it's still a left-leaning university and conventional university in almost every sense, but the leadership is very much supportive. And so I thought, well, we'll put on this new course, something you can't do at a regular university. We're going to look at woke as an ideology, the way we'd look at socialism or liberalism or fascism or anything else, objectively, analytically, but we're going to treat it as an ideology because it likes to cloak itself in the mantra of just being nice and, oh, it's just something everybody must agree with. Well, no, actually, it's DEI and woke is an ideology, and it happens to have control of a lot of institutions. We're going to study it as an ideology, how it arose, who supports it, the politics of it, the philosophy of it. So that's really what I did. And this open online course is available to anyone in the world. Low cost options as well if you just want lectures and readings. So just check out my Twitter if you want to sign up.
But you're also seeing like there is starting to be some pushback in larger institutions, not necessarily governments, but banks that have been, with either ESG requirements or DEI requirements saying, we have to function. We have to have people that know what they're doing. We need to, if we're trying to make money, invest in things that make money, not just invest in things we like. Like we're starting to see the debate at least come out of the closet a little bit.
Yeah, there's definitely been a shift in the last few years. And DEI is coming under more scrutiny. It's been cut back in corporations to some degree, but I would caution against those who want to say, well, woke has peaked, it's now fading away, and it'll be like McCarthyism, it'll be gone. I don't think that. And the reason I say that is because on so many of these attitudes, it's the younger part of the population that are more woke than the older. Yeah. And typically that'll be within, say, in Canada, for example, Liberal and NDP voters who are older are considerably less woke than Liberal and NDP voters who are younger. Now, it may not make as much difference amongst conservatives, but that age difference is there also in academia. Older professors are much more tolerant of free speech than younger professors. And my worry is, even though there's this temporary correction, as that Gen Z group becomes the median professor, employee, voter, right, they are going to change our culture away from that free speech, objective truth, classical liberal culture into this more cultural socialist atmosphere. And that's my worry is for the longer term.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. You or someone was quoting Milton Friedman on this, saying that a society that puts equality before freedom will end up with neither. And I think
that's a good thing.
Yeah, the debate that we're wrestling through right now. Really interesting. Great to talk with you. Thanks for doing this work.
Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed every minute of it, Pamela.
Well, okay, let's just tell people now. Eric Kaufmann, he's a Canadian, teaching politics in the UK. He's at the University of Buckingham. This class that you can find and sign up, Woke, the Origins, Dynamics, and Implications of an Elite Ideology. So they can just check you out at your Zoom site or not your Zoom, your
Twitter. I know its name changes from X to, but yeah, if you just go to my Twitter, which is at EPKAUFM, EP Kaufmann, the pinned tweet there will just take you there to sign up if you want. And the class has been, I've also got a seminar option where people are on Zoom, and that's been really fun. We've got Canadians, Brits, Americans, Europeans, others. Yeah.
Well, and they can also check out, because you're a fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and that's for whom you did this report, The Politics of Culture Wars in Contemporary Canada. So they can find that stuff there as well.
Yes, please. MLI is doing the best work in this area. So I definitely recommend people, not just myself, there's many other people who've written interesting stuff there. Okay,
lovely to meet you. We'll talk again, I bet. I bet we will.
I hope so. Keep up your good work too.
Okay,
Pamela.
We'll see you again. So that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you soon.